The morning sun had barely risen when Lami was dragged from her small clay hut, her wrists bound tightly with rough, fraying rope that scraped her skin with every tug. Her bare feet stumbled over the hard, uneven ground as two of the village guards yanked her forward, ignoring her quiet protests. The village was already awake, and whispers spread like dry grass catching fire as people emerged from their homes to see what was happening. Mothers paused from pounding millet, children abandoned their games, and men stood with folded arms, their eyes filled with curiosity and judgment. By the time they reached the wide-open clearing in the center of the village, a sizable crowd had formed, their murmurs weaving into a low, pulsing hum. The council's long wooden bench stood at the far end of the square, beneath the shade of the great baobab tree whose twisted roots seemed older than memory itself. The elders sat in a row, draped in flowing robes, their faces carved with deep lines from years of both wisdom and bitterness. The air was tense, heavy with an unspoken eagerness for spectacle. Lami's heart pounded in her chest, not just from fear but from disbelief. She still could not comprehend how the morning had brought her to this place. She had done nothing wrong, yet the eyes of her community looked upon her as if she carried a sickness. One of the elders, Chief Omari, rose slowly to his feet, leaning on his carved walking stick for authority more than support. His voice was deep and commanding as he announced the accusations. Lami had allegedly spoken words of disrespect toward the elders, questioning their decisions in front of others. Gasps rippled through the crowd, not because they believed it entirely, but because in their world to question authority, even in whispers, was to invite punishment. Lami's lips trembled as she tried to speak, but each time she opened her mouth, a murmur from the crowd drowned her voice, and the guards standing behind her shoved her forward until her knees nearly buckled. The truth was far less scandalous. 3 days earlier, while fetching water from the stream, Lami had overheard two young men mocking the council's ruling on a land dispute. She had simply told them to speak their complaints directly if they dared, not to hide behind gossip. Unfortunately, those same young men, fearing they might be exposed, turned the story against her, claiming she had been the one to speak ill of the elders. In the village's fragile hierarchy, the word of two favored sons carried more weight than the protest of a solitary young woman with no family to defend her. The council did not deliberate long. The verdict was swift, their judgment masked as justice but steeped in quiet malice. Lami would kneel before the council and kiss the feet of the very people who had slandered her name. The punishment was meant not only to humble her but to burn her dignity in front of the entire village. As the chief's words settled over the square, a murmur of excitement ran through the onlookers. Some came closer, eager for a better view. Others smirked knowingly, their eyes reflecting the cruelty of shared mockery. The young men who had lied about her were already stepping forward, grinning with the unearned power of their moment. Their feet were dusty from the morning walk, the skin roughened from years of wandering barefoot over the earth. They stood proudly, chests puffed out as though this humiliation proved their superiority. The council ordered Lami to kneel, and the guards pushed her down onto the coarse ground. The dry earth bit into her knees, sharp pebbles digging into her skin, but she kept her back straight, unwilling to hunch into the posture of defeat they wanted from her. Around her, the crowd closed in, the ring of faces blurring into one wall of eyes. She could smell the sweat of the bodies pressed together, hear the faint rustle of shifting feet and the occasional chuckle when someone whispered a cruel comment. The heat from the sun pressed down, and yet the coldness in their stares made her shiver. A few of the older women shook their heads, not entirely convinced of her guilt but unwilling to speak in her defense. The younger ones watched with a mix of pity and fear, knowing they could just as easily be in her place one day. The chief's voice rang out again, ordering her to begin. Lami's lips tightened. Every instinct in her body screamed to resist, to stand and shout the truth, but the eyes of the guards, the smirks of her accusers, and the unyielding authority of the council left her cornered. Slowly, she leaned forward, the dust rising around her as her hands pressed into the earth for balance. Her face was close enough now to smell the dry, unwashed skin of her first accuser's foot. He shifted slightly, his toes curling in mock anticipation, his smirk widening as if savoring the moment. The crowd hushed, their collective breath hanging in the air. The sound of her own breathing filled Lami's ears. She closed her eyes briefly, blocking out their faces, trying to find a fragment of strength within herself. The humiliation was not just in the act, but in knowing that no one, no friend, no neighbor, had stepped forward to shield her from it. She pressed her lips to the top of his foot, her mouth tasting the grit of dust and old sweat. A murmur of satisfaction passed through the crowd, and the second accuser stepped forward for his turn. The sun climbed higher, the ground beneath her growing hotter. By the time she finished the punishment, the dust clung to her lips and chin, her knees were raw, and her heart thudded with a mixture of shame and quiet fury. The council dismissed her without ceremony, their eyes already moving past her to the next matter of village business. But as she rose and looked out at the crowd, at the faces that had delighted in her pain, something inside her shifted. Beneath the humiliation, a slow ember of resolve began to burn, invisible to everyone but herself. It was in that moment she knew this was not the end of her story. The three figures stepped forward from the crowd as though they owned the ground beneath them, their chests puffed with pride and their mouths curled into those sharp, sly smiles that told Lami they had been waiting for this moment far longer than anyone else present. They were men and women of influence, people whose words carried weight in the council, whose gestures alone could sway opinion. To the rest of the village they were respected, even admired, but to Lami, they were the vipers who had spent months weaving lies around her name until every thread of falsehood was tied into a noose. The tallest of the three, Bako, walked with the deliberate slowness of someone who knew the spectacle was his. He was a wealthy trader, always dressed in fine robes, but today he wore a simpler garment, as though to emphasize the common dust on his feet, dust he would make her taste. He glanced at the other two, his sister Nari and his closest friend Oten, sharing a silent message only conspirators could understand. Lami could read it in their eyes: victory. Bako's smile widened as he reached the center of the circle. He removed his sandals without breaking eye contact with her, the leather straps slapping against his ankles as he tugged them free. His toes curled slightly as they touched the earth, and Lami saw the deep cracks along his heels, the ingrained dirt from years of travel. Even in her shame, she could see the detail of them: the peeling skin, the coarse edges that spoke of someone who had walked many miles yet never known the humility of kneeling. Beside him, Nari's smirk was sharper, more cutting. She had always carried herself with the grace of a queen, but now her elegance took on a cruel edge. She loosened the knots of her sandals slowly, theatrically, letting the leather thongs fall away as though she were shedding something precious. Her feet were not as rough as her brothers, but they were pale from lack of sun, her nails painted with a red dye that caught the light. Lami remembered the way Nari used to visit her mother's hut when they were children, always pretending to be a friend while stealing little trinkets when no one was watching. That false sweetness had only sharpened with age. Then came Oten, whose laughter was a rasping, unpleasant sound that grated against the ears. He bent to untie his sandals with exaggerated movements, casting mocking glances at the crowd to draw out their amusement. He had been the loudest voice at the council meeting when the accusation against Lami was read aloud, urging the elders to make an example of her. His feet were broad and heavy, the nails thickened and yellowed, the skin toughened into patches of hardened flesh. He set them deliberately in front of her, the way a hunter might place a trap. The air between them was thick, thick with the dust their bare feet stirred, thick with the unspoken satisfaction of those who had engineered this moment. Around them, the villagers leaned in, some smirking in shared malice, others averting their eyes but saying nothing. Silence had its own weight here, and every heartbeat seemed to make it heavier. Bako spoke first, his voice rich and slow, each word chosen for maximum sting. A woman who cannot respect her elders must learn to respect the feet that walk before her. The crowd chuckled at this, some nodding in agreement, others clapping lightly as though they were watching a performance. Nari tilted her head, her tone dripping with feigned pity. Poor Lami. Your father's land could have given you comfort for life. If only you had listened, but now see what pride has brought you. Oten laughed again, low and cruel. Kiss girl. Let the dust of our steps remind you who leads in this village. The three stood close enough that she could smell them, the earthy scent of the road clinging to Bako, the faint perfume on Nari's ankles, the acrid tang of Oten's sweat. Their toes flexed and curled slightly, eager for her to bend forward, to press her lips against the skin they believed was more worthy than her dignity. Lami's gaze flickered between them. She could see it now with a clarity that burned, how carefully they had planned this. Her father's death had been the first crack in her life, and they had driven their lies into it like wedges, splitting her world apart piece by piece. The accusations had been ridiculous at first, whispers that she had spoken out of turn, that she had insulted the council. But lies repeated long enough began to sound like truth, especially when spoken by people whose voices carried power. And now, with her shame displayed for all, they would take what was left: her will, her pride, her sense of self. The crowd's murmurs pressed in on her like a second circle, one made not of bodies but of judgment. Their smirks never wavered. They were the smiles of victors certain that the battle was over, that their prey had no choice but to yield. The dust at their feet swirled faintly in the dry air, catching the sun in tiny motes that danced between them. Bako shifted his stance, bringing his toes closer to her. Nari's gaze raked over her like a blade. Oten tilted his head and smirked wider as if daring her to resist. For them, this was more than punishment, it was a sealing of fate, a reminder to every watching eye that no one could stand against them. And yet, beneath their satisfaction, Lami caught a glimmer of something else, something they probably didn't even realize they were showing: fear. It was buried deep, hidden under layers of arrogance, but it was there. The kind of fear that comes from knowing that power taken by cruelty can be taken away by it, too. They just didn't think she could be the one to take it. The silence that wrapped around Lami was not the silence of surrender, it was the silence of storms gathering in the distance, heavy and waiting. She remained on her knees before them, the dust of the council ground clinging to her skin, the sun scorching the back of her neck. Every eye in the crowd was fixed on her, some wide with curiosity, others narrowed with the thrill of cruelty. But inside she was far away, back in the smoky warmth of her grandmother's hut, where the old woman's voice had once carried whispers like secrets through the air. Her grandmother had spoken of a curse not as a mere bedtime story, but as a warning handed down from women who had been wronged before her. When they force you to bow to shame, she had said, her wrinkled fingers tracing invisible shapes in the air, the earth listens. The earth remembers. And it answers in ways the proud cannot bear. Lami had been young then, not fully understanding. Now those words surged in her mind like the steady thrum of a war drum. The three stood above her, their shadows long and crooked against the sunlit ground. They mistook her silence for submission, for weakness. One of them, Mugo, with his broad chest and cruel laugh, leaned forward, his lips curling into a smirk that spoke of complete victory. His eyes told her he believed he had stripped her of dignity, crushed her spirit under the weight of the elder's judgment. He was wrong. Lami's silence was not emptiness, it was a shield, an unseen wall between her soul and their venom. The villagers murmured. A few women shifted uncomfortably, as if sensing something unspoken in her stillness. But the majority leaned closer, eager for the spectacle to begin. Lami could hear the crunch of footsteps as her enemies adjusted their stance, their bare feet grinding into the dirt. The smell of sweat and old leather reached her, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she let her breath grow deep and slow, almost ritual-like, as if she were preparing for something beyond this moment. Her grandmother had also told her, never return an insult with words, let your silence become their mirror. In it, they will see the rot they carry. And so Lami's head remained bowed, not because they had won, but because she refused to grant them the satisfaction of her breaking. Her heart beat like a drum inside her chest, not frantic but steady, each pulse fueling the strange, quiet energy growing within her. The air around her seemed to change. It was subtle at first, almost like the shifting of wind before a storm. A faint tremor rippled through the ground, so faint that only Lami seemed to notice. She could feel the earth's warmth beneath her palms, and in that warmth, a kind of recognition, as if the soil remembered her bloodline, her grandmother, the many women who had endured such trials before her. Her lips did not move. She did not pray aloud. But inside she called upon that legacy, on every injustice endured, on every tear swallowed, on every humiliation turned into quiet strength. The curse her grandmother spoke of was not an act of vengeance born from anger, but one born from balance, a way the world set things right without human hands. And in her silence, Lami was offering the earth her pain like an offering at a sacred altar. Her enemies laughed softly, mistaking her stillness for defeat. They did not see the storm she carried within. They did not feel the strange energy curling through the dust beneath their feet, an energy that had been waiting, patient and ancient, for someone to awaken it. The crowd only saw a young woman on her knees, her face calm, her lips sealed. But the silence that clung to her was no ordinary silence. It was the silence of something unseen, gathering strength, preparing to speak in a voice that was not her own. Lami's body felt as though it were made of stone as she crawled forward, the sharp gravel beneath her knees digging into her skin. The jeers and whispers of the gathered crowd rang in her ears, each sound magnifying the weight of her shame. She dared not look up, for she knew the eyes above her brimmed with satisfaction at her downfall. Her breathing was shallow, but it was steady, too steady for someone in her position. Somewhere deep inside her, past the swirling storm of humiliation and grief, there was a quiet, dangerous calm. Her enemies stood tall above her, their feet bare now, the dust of the earth clinging stubbornly to their cracked heels and calloused toes. She could smell them, sweat mixed with the musk of the soil, and the stench was thick, almost suffocating. The council members watched in silence, their faces unreadable. No one stepped forward to stop this spectacle. This was not justice, it was a performance. And Lami was the unwilling actor. Her hands, trembling ever so slightly, moved first to the oldest man's foot. She hesitated, her lips hovering above the cracked skin, the air heavy with the scent of dust and heat. The crowd leaned closer, some in morbid fascination, others in cruel delight. A voice in her mind, faint but firm, reminded her of her grandmother's words. When the heart is forced low, the spirit may rise in ways no one expects. Lami swallowed hard, ignoring the lump in her throat, and let her lips touch the man's foot. The instant contact was made, she felt it, a strange, pulsing warmth that surged into her mouth and spread across her face. It wasn't the warmth of the sun or body heat, it was deeper, older, as if the earth itself was pushing something through her. Her chest tightened, but she didn't pull away. The man's skin twitched under her lips, and he gave an awkward grunt, though he quickly masked it with a smirk. She moved to the second man, whose smirk was sharper, more venomous. His foot was even filthier, caked in a layer of dry mud. Her lips brushed against it, and again that heat came, only now it lingered, curling through her tongue and settling in her throat like slow-burning embers. The air felt heavier, the murmurs of the crowd fainter, as though she and these men stood alone in a space separate from the rest of the world. By the time she reached the third man, her heartbeat had slowed. Her trembling had ceased. Something deep in her gut told her this was no ordinary act of submission. She placed her lips to his foot, and this time the heat flooded her entirely, rising through her chest, spilling into her arms and prickling the skin of her hands. She heard a faint crackle in her ears, like the sound of dry wood catching fire. The man shifted his stance uncomfortably, his smile faltering for just an instant. When it was over, Lami sat back on her heels, her head still lowered. The crowd exhaled as if a tense moment had passed without incident. The council muttered among themselves, satisfied the punishment had been carried out. But inside Lami, the strange heat settled into something heavier, an unseen weight that pulsed in time with her heartbeat. She did not yet know it, but with every kiss, something had been planted. Something the earth had remembered. Something her grandmother's warnings had been preparing her for. And though the air in the square seemed normal again, it held a faint, sharp edge, one that her enemies would soon feel on their own skin. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon and the village's chatter began to fade into the night, the three enemies were still walking around with smug faces, replaying the scene of Lami's humiliation in their minds like a victory song. But as the cool air of evening settled in, each of them felt a faint, irritating warmth prickling at their feet. At first, they dismissed it, perhaps the dust of the day or the sun's heat lingering in their skin. Yet within an hour the sensation sharpened, no longer warmth but a pulsing heat that seemed to dig deep into their bones. The first of them, Bako, sat on his veranda rubbing his feet, frowning as he noticed the skin was no longer its usual dull brown but flushed red. He blamed it on walking barefoot for too long during the day, but when his wife brought a basin of water to soak them, the moment they touched the water, he gasped. The coolness didn't soothe, it stung like acid. He yanked his feet out, startled by how the pain traveled up to his calves, leaving them trembling. Meanwhile, Kumi, the second enemy, was busy hosting a small group of friends, retelling the story of Lami's public disgrace with exaggerated gestures and bursts of laughter. His audience chuckled along until his expression faltered. A sharp, stabbing sensation spread from the balls of his feet to his toes, and beads of sweat formed on his forehead. Trying not to limp, he excused himself and hurried inside. When he pulled off his sandals, his heart skipped. His soles were dotted with small, angry blisters, each one throbbing in time with his heartbeat. The third, Manda, was already in bed when it began. At first she thought the itch was from a mosquito bite, but within minutes, it became a deep, searing pain. She kicked off her blanket, clutching her foot in the dim moonlight, and her breath caught. The skin was not just red, it was swelling as if something was pushing from beneath, a pressure that pulsed like a living thing. Her toes curled involuntarily, and every slight movement made her wince. By the time the moon was high, all three were wide awake, their pain intensifying. They tried everything, wrapping their feet in wet cloths, rubbing them with oil, whispering prayers under their breath. But the heat refused to fade, it grew hotter with every passing minute. The blisters swelled further, their surfaces slick with moisture that steamed faintly in the lamplight. A faint, acrid smell began to drift up from their feet, like wet earth after lightning strikes. In the stillness of the night, each of them thought of the same moment without wanting to, Lami's lips pressing against their skin, her bowed head, her silence. The memory was supposed to bring satisfaction, but now it churned uneasily in their stomachs. Bako muttered curses under his breath, telling himself it was coincidence. Kumi avoided looking at his feet altogether, his earlier bravado replaced by a gnawing unease. Manda, however, could not stop thinking of the stories the old women told, the ones about curses that traveled through touch, carried by shame, only to return with fury. Outside, the village slept, unaware that 3 of its most respected members now writhed in private agony. The night wind carried the sound of their restless shuffling, their muffled groans, and the occasional hissed cry when the pain flared too sharply. And in the darkness, though they could not see it yet, something was beginning to stir beneath their skin, as if the burn had a will of its own. It was only the beginning. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, the village was already buzzing. Shadows of dawn stretched over the dusty paths, and yet people were out, their voices lowered but urgent. Word had traveled faster than the morning wind. Lami's enemies had fallen ill. Not with the common fevers that came during the rains, nor with the stomach sicknesses that sometimes swept through the huts. No, this was something stranger. Those who had seen the 3 influential villagers the night before swore their feet were swollen like gourds, the skin blistered and red, as if they had walked barefoot across burning coals. Some whispered that it wasn't just pain, they claimed the skin shimmered faintly, like embers glowing under ash. By the well, 2 women drew water but did not meet each other's eyes. "I heard they couldn't sleep," one murmured, glancing over her shoulder. "The pain kept them awake. They say the blisters throb with every heartbeat." Another leaned closer. "And the smell, like burnt skin though no fire touched them." Others had their own versions of the tale. A shepherd boy insisted he saw a faint orange glow trailing Lami as she left the council grounds the day before, almost like a ribbon of fire following her steps. An old man claimed he had felt the air shift when she pressed her lips to the first foot, a sudden heaviness as though the earth itself was holding its breath. The whispers grew bolder as the morning wore on. At the grain market, traders paused mid-sale to exchange rumors. "This is no ordinary sickness," said one, shaking his head. "Her grandmother was a woman of power. I remember." Indeed, many recalled stories of Lami's grandmother, a healer and keeper of old ways. Though she had died years ago, some believed her knowledge still lingered, perhaps in the bloodline, perhaps in the very soil around their homestead. It was said she knew of curses, not the reckless kind cast in anger, but those that moved silently, taking root in the heart of injustice and flowering in their own time. By mid-morning, fear had taken root. The 3 men who had humiliated Lami were respected by some, feared by others, but now even their allies avoided their huts. People crossed the path rather than walk near their doors. Children were warned not to stare too long, lest the sickness leap from one person to another. In the heart of the village, near the council's meeting hut, 2 elders sat in tense conversation. "This will bring unrest," one said grimly. "If the people believe she has power, they will question the council's judgment." The other frowned. "Perhaps it is coincidence." But even as he spoke, his voice wavered. "Still, it is troubling. We must watch her." And through it all, Lami said nothing. She stayed in her small hut at the edge of the village, mending a torn basket with slow, careful movements. She did not seek out the gossip, but she could feel it in the air, the way people's eyes lingered on her longer than before, the way footsteps hesitated near her door. Late that afternoon, a young girl approached with a gourd of water. "Mama says to give you this," she said, her eyes wide. She hesitated before leaving, as if expecting Lami to say something to confirm the rumors. But Lami only nodded her thanks and went back to her work. Inside, she could still feel the strange warmth from the day before lingering in her lips, faint but undeniable, like the echo of an old fire. She remembered her grandmother's words, "When the proud bend you to the ground, rise slowly. For the earth has a memory and it listens." By nightfall, the whispers had changed into something heavier, fear mixed with awe. People began to speak of Lami with a new caution, not as the shamed woman who knelt in the dust, but as someone who had walked away carrying something unseen, something dangerous. And though no one dared to say it aloud in the council's presence, more than a few wondered, if such a curse could fall upon her enemies, what else might she be capable of? The 3 enemies hobbled into the village square the next morning, leaning on sticks and clutching at one another for balance. Their feet were wrapped in hastily torn cloth, but the crimson blotches seeping through betrayed the severity of their wounds. Every step drew a hiss of pain from their mouths, and yet their eyes burned hotter than the fever in their souls. The villagers, already murmuring about the events of the day before, stopped what they were doing to watch. Children peered from behind their mothers' skirts. Men abandoned their morning repairs, and women paused in their pounding of grain. The square filled quickly, the smell of dust and sweat mixing with the tension that now hung in the air. "There she is," one of them spat, pointing a trembling, knotted finger toward Lami, who was crouched by the well drawing water. Her head snapped up, startled, the wooden bucket dangling from the rope. The tallest of the three, a man named Jor, whose mouth had always been twisted in a permanent sneer, limped forward. "Witch," he barked, his voice cracking with rage and pain. "You think your curses will go unanswered?" Lami blinked, stunned. "Curses? I have done nothing." "Nothing?" Another enemy, Mbeku, snarled. "We made you kneel, made you kiss the dirt from our feet, and now look at us. Our flesh burns as though set aflame. This is no sickness of the earth, it is your doing." The crowd gasped, several people drawing back instinctively. To accuse someone of witchcraft in the village was no small matter. It was a charge that could bring exile or worse. Lami's heart pounded against her ribs. She opened her mouth to defend herself, but before she could speak, the third enemy, Old Morrow, stepped forward, his eyes wild. "I saw it. When she touched her lips to my foot, I felt it, heat like coal pressed against skin. She poisoned us with her witch mouth." Some villagers muttered in agreement, while others looked uneasy, shifting from foot to foot. The air was taut, ready to snap. It was then that the village healer, a tall woman with a spine as straight as a spear and a face weathered by years of tending the sick, stepped into the circle. Her name was Oma, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who had seen far too many deaths to waste words on foolishness. "Bring me their feet," she commanded. The three hesitated, glancing at one another. Jor was the first to comply, lowering himself with a wince and unwinding the cloth from his foot. Gasps rippled through the crowd at the sight, skin blistered and red, swelling so much that the toes looked like they might burst. The other two revealed the same condition, their feet twitching involuntarily with every pulse of pain. Oma knelt, examining them closely. She sniffed the wounds, touched the edges of the blisters lightly with her fingers, then leaned back with a grim expression. "This is not rot from filth, nor fever from within," she said slowly. "The marks are too even, too deep. These wounds are not made by human hands." Her words sent a shiver through the crowd. Not made by human hands. That could only mean one thing, the work of spirits. The three enemies seized on her words instantly. "Spirits obey the will of witches," Morrow cried. "She summoned them against us." But Oma shook her head sharply. "Not so fast. There are spirits that walk without summons, spirits that answer only to their own laws. If this is their work, then it is not Lami who brought it upon you, it is your own actions that have opened the door to them." A murmur spread through the onlookers. Some looked away, suddenly remembering the sight of Lami kneeling in the dirt, her lips pressed to the bare feet of the very men who now stood crippled. Others avoided her gaze altogether. Jor's mouth twisted further. "You protect her because you pity her. But pity will not save you when her curse spreads." Lami finally found her voice, though it trembled. "I did nothing but obey. You demanded my humiliation and I gave it to you. If something followed, it is not from me, it is from the shame you made me carry." Her words hung in the air, heavier than the midday heat. No one moved for several long moments. Finally, Oma stood, her staff striking the ground once. "Enough. If you wish to accuse her, bring proof, not fear. Until then, the matter is closed. Tend to your wounds as you see fit, but do not call on my help again unless you are ready to speak the full truth of what happened." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving the three enemies fuming and unsteady on their feet. The crowd slowly dispersed, but the whispers did not stop. By the time the sun dipped low that evening, the village was divided. Some were convinced Lami was a witch. Others began to wonder if perhaps the humiliation had indeed awakened something older and far more dangerous than any mortal curse. And in the shadows of her hut, Lami sat alone, clutching the memory of her grandmother's warning like a lifeline, her mind spinning with questions she could not yet answer. The council hut was dim, the air thick with the smell of burning herbs. Outside, a restless crowd had gathered, their murmurs spilling into the room like the hiss of an oncoming storm. Lami sat in the center, her wrists bound with rough rope, her eyes lowered but her back unbent. The enemies she had been forced to kneel before sat to one side, their swollen feet wrapped in cloth, their faces twisted not only in pain but in humiliation. The village elders exchanged glances. One of them, a tall man with skin like polished mahogany and eyes sharp as a hawk's, leaned forward. "Lami," he said slowly, they accuse you of sorcery, of bringing this sickness upon them. Lami's heart thudded in her chest. 4 days she had endured the whispers, the sideways glances, the cautious distance people now kept from her. She could have kept silent, let the truth remain buried, but something deep within her, something older than fear, rose to the surface. She lifted her head. My grandmother told me this day would come, she began, her voice quiet but steady. She said there are wounds that are not made by knives or fire, but by shame, and that the spirits do not let such wounds go unanswered. The elders leaned in, the crackling fire casting dancing shadows on their weathered faces. She told me of a blessing given to the women of our bloodline, Lami continued. A gift from the ancestors to protect us when we are made to kneel against our will. When a man forces humiliation upon us, when he makes us bow, touch, or kiss against our dignity, he carries that shame upon his own body. The mark shows itself in ways no healer's herb can cure. Gasps filled the hut. One of the accused shifted uncomfortably, his face paling. My grandmother called it the kiss of the flame, Lami said, her eyes now fixed on her accusers. It burns those who seek to burn us in spirit. You felt the heat when I touched your feet, not because I cursed you, but because the spirits answered your act. The healer, an old woman with hair white as salt, stepped forward and lifted the cloth from one man's foot. The blisters were angry and red, pulsing faintly as if an ember lay beneath the skin. She touched it gently and frowned. This is no fever, she said to the elders. This is no infection. I have seen wounds from fire, from boiling water, but this burn came from something unseen. One of the elders turned to Lami. Why did you not speak of this before? Because, she replied softly, it is not a weapon. It is a shield. My grandmother told me it must only be spoken of when the truth would protect others, not just myself. She looked around the hut, her gaze sweeping over the women gathered in the crowd. I will not hide it anymore. If you try to humiliate me or any woman of my blood, the spirits will answer. They always have. They always will. A hush fell over the room. Even the fire seemed to quiet, its crackle replaced by the sound of slow, uneasy breathing. The enemies shifted in their seats, their bravado crumbling like clay in the sun. One muttered under his breath, it was just a game, just to put her in her place. But Lami cut him off. You put me in the place the spirits prepared for you. That is all. The healer stepped back, folding her arms. The girl speaks truth. These wounds were not made by human hands. They carry the weight of something older, something we should not challenge. One by one the elders nodded. The murmurs outside grew louder, now tinged with awe rather than suspicion. Some said they could feel the weight of unseen eyes upon the gathering, the presence of ancestors standing in silent judgment. Finally the eldest of the council spoke. Then it is decided. Lami will not be punished. The spirits have already judged those who wronged her. Let this be a warning to all, shame given will return to the giver. The ropes around Lami's wrists were cut. She rose slowly, her hands free, her heart beating with a strange mixture of relief and defiance. The crowd parted for her as she stepped out of the hut, the sunlight falling on her face. Behind her, the whispers began anew, not in fear this time but in reverence. The tale of the kiss of the flame would spread beyond the village before the week's end, carried by traders, travelers, and wandering storytellers. Mothers would whisper it to their daughters, women would repeat it to one another in the fields, and men would think twice before demanding acts meant to break a woman's spirit. Lami walked on, the warmth of the sun on her skin and the weight of her grandmother's blessing in her heart. She did not look back, for she knew she had already left her mark, on her enemies, on her village, and on the path of every woman who would come after her. The council gathered at first light, summoned by the healer's urgent message and the murmurs that had spread through every corner of the village. They met in the large open hut at the center of the square, where carved wooden posts told the stories of past judgments, both fair and cruel. The air was tense, thick with the smell of damp earth after the night's rain. Villagers crowded outside the hut, straining to hear, their faces a mixture of curiosity, fear, and anticipation. Inside, the three enemies, Te Moyo and Adani, sat hunched in shame, their feet wrapped in white cloth already spotted with yellow and red from the blisters beneath. They could barely stand, yet pride kept their backs rigid. Lami sat across from them, not gloating, not even smiling, just calm, her hands folded in her lap. She wore the same simple dress from the day before, as if to remind them all that nothing about her had changed except the truth now laid bare. The eldest of the council, Baba Alakunal, stood slowly, leaning on his carved staff. His voice was deep and deliberate, the kind that silenced any room without effort. We have heard the accusations. We have heard the healer's words. We have heard Lami's truth. But before we judge, we will listen, one last time, to those who brought this matter to us. Moyo was the first to speak. His voice was raw, perhaps from pain or from the humiliation of sitting before the council with his crimes exposed. She bewitched us, he insisted, glaring at Lami. What happened to our feet cannot be natural. It burns like coals even as I sit. She has cursed us to suffer. The healer, an old woman named Writhed, stepped forward without being asked. Her voice was sharp but not unkind. What burns you is not magic born of malice but magic born of protection. Your wounds are not the kind one can heal with herbs or water. They will fade but only when your shame fades. And shame fades only when wrongs are set right. A murmur rose from the villagers gathered outside. Some nodded in agreement, others whispered about the danger of angering such blessings again. Baba Alakunal looked to Lami. And you, child, what do you ask of this council? Lami took a breath. I ask for nothing but what is mine. My land which they took. My dignity which they tried to strip away. And I ask for a promise, from this council and from the people, that no one will ever again be forced to kneel or bow or kiss the feet of another as punishment. Humiliation is not justice. Her words hung in the air like the lingering scent of rain, fresh, cleansing, but heavy with meaning. The council members exchanged glances. One by one they nodded. Baba Alakunal raised his staff. Then hear our judgment. Te Moyo and Adani, you have been found guilty of theft, cruelty and abuse of power. You will return Lami's land immediately. You will also work her fields for one planting season, under her instruction as repayment for the harm you caused. The three shifted uncomfortably, but the pain in their feet kept them from protest. And more, Baba Alakunal continued, his voice firm. From this day forward, the punishment of humiliation is forbidden in this village. No man or woman shall be made to kneel, bow, or kiss the feet of another. We will judge with fairness, not cruelty. The crowd outside erupted in approval, cheers mixing with the beating of drums. Some cried out Lami's name in gratitude, others simply looked at her with newfound respect. The council scribe stepped forward, marking the judgment on a strip of bark that would be stored with the other records of law. As the meeting ended, the three enemies limped out, their eyes avoiding Lami's. She did not gloat, nor did she speak to them. She simply walked past them, head high, toward the edge of the square where her grandmother's old house still stood, waiting for her return. But as she passed the crowd, women reached out to touch her hand, men nodded in acknowledgement, and children followed behind her as if she were some quiet hero. The humiliation that had been meant to break her had instead made her unshakable. By the time she reached her door, the morning sun had broken through the clouds, casting a golden light over her land, the land that was hers again. And though the council's decree would be remembered for generations, the people knew it was Lami's strength that had made it possible. They said the land remembered her, and so did the people. Long after the blisters healed, long after the enemies of Lami had limped away from the shame they had tried to inflict, her story became more than a whispered memory, it became a warning etched into the bones of the village. Children heard it before they could even walk. Elders repeated it when disputes turned ugly. And travelers who passed through learned to tread lightly, for here in this place humiliation was not just cruelty, it was dangerous. In the years after the council's judgment, life slowly returned to normal for Lami. Her fields flourished again, not because the soil was richer than before, but because her heart was free of the bitterness that could choke a farmer's spirit. She lived quietly, tending her crops, raising goats, and occasionally sitting by the river to hum the songs her grandmother used to sing. People would visit her now, some to thank her, others to seek advice. A few came only to see if the rumors were true, if her eyes still held the quiet fire that had brought down her enemies without a single blow. The three women who had shamed her faded from the center of village life. Their authority was gone, their voices no longer carried weight in the council, and their families bore the mark of disgrace for years. They could still be seen sometimes at the market, but people avoided meeting their eyes. The blisters on their feet had long since healed, but the memory of that burning pain was something they carried every step for the rest of their lives. As the seasons passed, the tale of Lami began to stretch beyond its original borders. In the beginning it was told faithfully, how three women forced another into shame, how the pain they intended for her found its way back to them, blistered and burning. But like all stories, it began to change with the telling. Some versions claimed that Lami's kiss had been visible, a glowing mark that burned into her enemy's skin. Others said the invisible flame people spoke of was a spirit that followed her, loyal to her family's bloodline. In one telling, she was said to have stood in the middle of the village square as her enemies writhed on the ground, screaming for mercy. Lami herself never corrected the stories. She simply smiled when she heard them, for she knew the truth was more powerful than the myth, and the truth was that shame cannot be forced upon the innocent without cost. The saying took root like a weed and could not be pulled out. Asterisk, if you force shame upon the innocent, it will return to you blistered and burning. Asterisk at first, it was a caution muttered among the older villagers. Later, it was carved into the wood above the council house. Parents used it to stop children from cruel pranks, merchants used it to settle disputes, and even the fiercest warriors repeated it before deciding on a punishment for an accused thief. The curse of Lami's kiss was not just feared, it became law in spirit if not in writing. Once, a traveling merchant from the coast tried to make a spectacle of a local boy who had stolen fruit from his cart. He tied the boy to a post in the square and mocked him before the crowd. That night, the merchant awoke with a searing pain in his feet. By morning he could not walk. People whispered about Lami's curse, though no one could prove it had been called upon. The merchant left within the week, limping so badly his cart wheels squealed under the uneven pull. Lami lived to see her hair turn silver. She kept to herself in her later years, but her presence was enough to keep cruelty at bay. There was a dignity about her that no one dared disturb. Children, who had never known the world before her story, would sometimes follow her at a distance, daring each other to get close enough to see her feet, as if they expected to find the secret of her power there. When she died, the village buried her on the hill overlooking her land. On the day of her burial, no one laughed, no one sang, and no one made speeches of victory. Instead, they placed her grandmother's walking stick beside her and laid a small bowl of river water at her grave, a symbol of cleansing and the memory of the day she had walked away from the square with her head held high. Generations later, when the wind blew over the hill and down into the fields, it was said you could hear a soft humming in the air. Some believed it was the song her grandmother once sang to her. Others said it was the hiss of a flame that never fully went out. And when someone in the village considered punishing another through public shame, they would feel the weight of countless eyes on them, as though the land itself was watching, waiting to see if history would repeat itself. No one wanted to test it. And so the story lived on, not just in words but in the way the people treated one another. Fear had its part in that, but so did respect. The villagers learned that punishment could be just without being cruel, and that dignity, once taken, had a way of returning with a vengeance. The curse of Lami's kiss became less about the burning blisters and more about the unseen balance that the world always seemed to demand. Long after the names of her enemies were forgotten, Lami's name remained, spoken softly by parents at night, written in the margins of old council records, and carried in the memories of the hills and rivers she had once walked. She had turned her humiliation into a shield, her pain into a warning, and her life into a legend. And so it was said, if you force shame upon the innocent, it will return to you blistered and burning.